Martin Luther King Blessed Are the Peacemakers Whidbey Island community event has returned to the St. Augustine's in the Wood Episcopal Church as an in-person, live event after 2 years as a YouTube video production in COVID purgatory. This year's theme was America's Original Sin, the consequences of slavery, white racism, and the struggle for racial justice. This video is a condensed, abridged version of the live event. Blessed Are the Peacemakers, through song and readings, seeks to inform a predominantly white middle-class gathering about the African American experience. This year's event explored the economic, racial, and social impact or cost of slavery, a cost that includes white systemic racism and white privilege, costs that still impact our nation. The Martin Luther King Blessed Are the Peacemakers gathering will continue, as it has in recent years, to call for a racial reckoning or understanding of white racism among Whidbey residents. Systemic racism is often not codified and not always obvious, but like pornography, you know it when you see it or are impacted by it. Most European Americans either don't realize or they refuse to understand the impact of systemic racism. What is white privilege? White privilege can best be defined by what you don't experience. White Americans don't fear being pulled over by officers for real, exaggerated, or non-existing minor traffic offenses. White Americans don't factor in race when obtaining a house or rental. Ultimately, white privilege is not worrying about race or racism daily, a luxury African Americans don't have.
It's already been time to wash away what does not serve. It's already been time to clear away the hurt, to end the broken silence, shine the light of painful truth, to make the body whole. Has already been time. Face all of our oppression. One can cannot see, one fright and inattention, when blindness just can't see, because we won't acknowledge, doesn't mean it is not so. Wake up and pay attention, be complicit in the whole. It's already been time to wash away what does not serve. It's already been time to clear away the hurt, to end the broken silence, shine the light of painful truth, to make the body whole. Has already been time.
In 1619, a ship flying the Dutch flag came to Jamestown. 20 Africans were traded for tobacco, and the American colonies became part of a worldwide enslavement of Africans by Europeans. By the end of the 17th century, African slavery was codified in all 13 colonies. Enslavement of Africans differed from other forms of slavery in that an enslaved person was chattel property for life, like cows, horses, and hogs. Recorded as numbers on census and property documents, the enslaved were not given the dignity of a name. The enslavement of Africans differed from earlier forms of slavery in that the slave status was based upon physical traits, primarily dark skin. In 1676, Nathaniel Bacon led an insurrection with mobs of small landholders, servants, and enslaved Africans. The revolt was put down, but laws codifying African slavery and its identification with skin color followed. In legalizing slavery, white supremacy was also codified. Poor whites were now members of a superior race. But states north of Maryland abolished slavery between 1782 and 1801, albeit through gradual emancipation. An abolitionist movement took root, drawing on Christian theology. Attempting to justify slavery, European churches cherry-picked from the Bible, but the African American slave church was different. While it looked to Jesus for salvation, it also identified with the enslavement of the Hebrews and gave an importance to Moses as a liberator, almost equal to Jesus. The slave church often spoke or sang in code. For example, Wade in the water could be a reference to baptism, but it could also be instructions for runaways. Walk in the creeks so the slave patrol bloodhounds can't find your scent.
See that candle dressed in red, God's gonna trouble the water. Looks like the band that Moses led, God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Look over yonder, what do I see? God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
The economics of slavery made abolition difficult. It had become an important driver of economic growth in the United States, both North and South. Slaves reached their highest market value in 1860 when a single adult slave sold for an average of $800, the equivalent of $180,000 in today's money. The institution of human bondage in the South also created a huge wealth gap, wealth being determined by real estate and slave ownership. This wealth gap between the wealthy planters and non-slave owning whites was unsustainable. Only 20% of the Southern population owned slaves, and less than 1% owned more than 100 slaves, the definition of a planter. The solution was an appeal to white supremacy. Poor whites, by virtue of their complexion, were part of the ruling class. They were deemed superior to the enslaved. Thus, although not owning an enslaved person, poor whites supported the institution of African slavery and white racism. Despite the economic power of slavery, a pre-Civil War abolitionist movement existed in which many African Americans were prominent. Among them, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. Douglass, in particular, was important in moving Lincoln, in spite of his support for white supremacy, to become the great emancipator. Slavery was actually destroyed not by a temporary presidential decree, but by the enslaved leaving the plantations and flocking to federal troops. With slavery destroyed and the Confederacy defeated, plantation lands could have been expropriated and divided among the formerly enslaved. Unfortunately, this was an opportunity missed, and the result of the white planters kept their land, and the enslaved became sharecroppers. The planters continued to be wealthy and politically powerful, while both white and black sharecroppers were exploited.
We, the formerly enslaved, thought we was going to be richer than white folks, 'cause we was stronger and knowed how to work, and whites didn't have us to work for them anymore. But it didn't turn out that way. We soon found out freedom could make folks proud, but it didn't make them rich. Felix Hayward, former Texas slave.
The formerly enslaved could vote, that is, until 1877, when federal troops withdrew from the South. Then, with the North no longer interested in African American rights, disenfranchisement of the African Americans was achieved through economic pressure and the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan. White racism had reared its ugly head. Unfortunately, for every advance in human rights, there was pushback.
Paul and Silas found a jail, had no money for a mail. Keep your eyes on the prize. Paul and Silas began to shout, that the Lord open and walk not out. Keep your eyes on the prize. Oh,
In the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision, the Supreme Court legalized segregation, establishing the infamous separate but equal doctrine. A caste system, defined by skin color, was approved. Those identified by even the slightest sub-Saharan African heritage were dehumanized, the one-drop rule. In contrast, any person deemed white was considered superior. In addition to the terrorism of the Klan and the lynchings of black males, history was rewritten. The Civil War became the lost cause, or War of Northern Aggression. Confederate soldiers were honored for bravery and valor. Statues of Confederate generals went up throughout the South and even in many northern states. Following World War I, African Americans began to flee the terror, degradation, and poverty of the Southern Jim Crow caste system. The Great Migration, the greatest internal migration of people within the United States, continued unabated for 40 years. In the North, African Americans did find economic opportunities, but they were usually the last hired and first fired. A familiar enemy, Jim Crow, had followed them north. More and more Southern black refugees were concentrated into smaller and smaller areas. When these communities of color did experience modest economic success, like Tulsa's Greenwood or Black Wall Street, they were often met with vigilante violence. The white attack on and the destruction of the Greenwood and massacre of its residents was expunged from history books and official records. African Americans responded to the 20th century Jim Crow through both a legal approach, exemplified by W.E.B. Du Bois, and the economic self-help approach of Booker T. Washington. Mary Bethune, through her activism and political connections, was referred to in the African American communities as the female Booker T. Washington. The legal strategy culminated in the Brown v. Board of Education decision, which overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. However, de facto segregation continued. It would require civilly disobedient activism to overturn Jim Crow. The impetus for this activism came from a Montgomery woman who refused to accept segregated seating on the city buses. Rosa Parks's action galvanized the Montgomery African American community. A young Baptist preacher became the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott and the promoter of a nonviolent civil disobedience.
There comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. There comes a time, friends, when people get tired of being thrown across the abyss of humiliation where they experience the bleakness of nagging despair. We are here. We are here because we are tired now. Now, let us say we are not advocating violence. We have overcome that. The only weapon we have in our hands this evening is the power of protest. We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we were wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer and never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. And we are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream.
Montgomery inspired student nonviolent sit-ins in Greensboro and Nashville. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, with its bottom-up leadership, exemplified by Diane Nash, John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, Bob Moses, among others, was on the cutting edge of nonviolent activism. Birmingham became the showdown in the struggle against Jim Crow segregation laws. The use of fire hoses, police dogs, and batons against the Children's March forced Congress to act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed under the leadership of a white Southern president, but there had been violent pushback to the 1963 Birmingham Campaign and March on Washington. On Sunday, September 15th, following the 1963 March on Washington, the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed, and 4 girls, ages 11 to 14, Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, and Carol Roberts, died in the explosion. The SNCC-led voting rights movement came to a head in Selma. The Selma movement was met with violence. This was not about being served at a lunch counter. This was about political power. There were martyrs: Jimmy Lee Jackson, the Reverend James Reeb, Viola Luiso, and Jonathan Daniels. Bloody Sunday caught the nation's attention when the Alabama State Police attacked marchers with clubs and tear gas. The result of an awakened nation was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The culmination of this change in political power reached its zenith in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama.
Tell me when, if not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, if not now, tell me when. Tell me when. Here we go. If not now, if not now, tell me when. If not now, we may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when. So
Legal Jim Crow was eliminated and the voting rights expanded, but white racism was still alive and well. Martin Luther King understood the connection of economics and the racial wealth gap to racism. With the encouragement and prodding of Marion Wright, he undertook the planning of a Poor People's Campaign. Less than a month before he was assassinated, Dr. King spoke to a predominantly white audience in an affluent suburb of Detroit about the other America.
I want to discuss the race problem tonight, and I want to discuss it very honestly. I do not see how we will ever solve the turbulent problem of race confronting our nation until there is an honest confrontation with it, and a willing search for the truth, and a willingness to admit the truth when we discover it. There are 2 Americas. One America is beautiful. In this America, millions of people have the milk of prosperity and the honey of equality flowing before them. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, culture and education for their minds, freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, children grow up in the sunlight of opportunity, but there is another America. This other America has a daily ugliness about it that transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this other America, thousands and thousands of people, men in particular, walk the streets in search for jobs that do not exist. In this other America, millions of people are forced to live in vermin-filled, distressing housing conditions where they do not have the privilege of having wall-to-wall carpeting, but all too often they end up with wall-to-wall rats and roaches. In this other America, thousands of young people are deprived of an opportunity to get an adequate education. Every year, thousands finish high school reading at a 7th, 8th, and sometimes 9th grade level. not because they don't have the native intelligence, but because the schools are so inadequate, so overcrowded, so devoid of quality, that the best in these minds can never come out. So in this other America, unemployment is a reality, and underemployment is a reality.
The Poor People's Campaign challenged the economic core of white privilege and the false claims of white supremacy. It exposed the denial of wealth to African Americans and poor European Americans. The labor of black, poor whites, Chicano farm workers, and women had built America, but they remained divided by the white racism and sexism. A new paradigm was necessary.
I think it is necessary for us to realize that we have moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. There must be a radical redistribution of economic and political power. After Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution. In short, we have moved into an era where we are called upon to raise certain basic questions about the whole society. Martin Luther King.
Dr. King's challenge of the economic system and opposition to a war of choice in Southeast Asia led to his assassination. But his vision remains with us. He had been to the mountaintop, but his vision remains unfulfilled.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The African American experience has expanded rights for all Americans by calling for a fulfillment on the promises of the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and faith-based concepts of justice. But just as important, it has indicted America for a failure to deal with its original sin. The problem of racism is not an African American problem. It is a white problem. As a gathering of predominantly white folks on South Whidbey Island, we are called to educate others about systemic racism. Martin Luther King knew that white racism was ultimately a white problem, and in the letter from the Birmingham jail, he expressed his frustration.
I must make two confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will.
The arc of the moral universe may bend towards justice, but it is a jagged arc. White racism is persistent. For each human rights gain, there is pushback to preserve white privilege. Systemic racism is still alive and well. The election of Barack Obama was an opportunity for a white racial reckoning, but the person who was elected after Obama's second term came down the escalator to announce his candidacy by spouting racist comments towards Mexican immigrants and Muslims. His racist views of America soon included African and Jewish Americans. His racial, misogynistic appeal to white workers was not subtle. His presidency made it okay to hate. White nationalists were referred to as good people and enjoyed influence in his administration. People, particularly youth, took to the streets in protest, but rural and working-class white Americans didn't understand police brutality towards African Americans or the Black Lives Matter movement. They didn't identify with the millions of women who marched to protest the election of the wannabe authoritarian. They didn't understand or identify with the estimated 15 to 25 million individuals who participated in the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. These racial justice protests were interracial and youthful. It appeared that America might have a racial reckoning, but that opportunity was lost, and white nationalism again reared its ugly head. The fact that South Whidbey is a predominantly white community makes an inclusive education more important. South Whidbey is not free from the influences of white racism. The school board has been disrupted by those who object to multiracial history, to environmental studies, to a display of Black Lives Matter banner, and to LGBTQ rights. A minority of South Whidbey residents and outside individuals used critical race theory as a dog whistle or code for opposing teaching multiracial and multicultural history. They expressed concerns that a serious, critical look at slavery and Jim Crow would traumatize their children. But there is hope. What does hope look like in South Whidbey? On South Whidbey, progressive high school student activists organized as the United Student Leaders, or USL. Their protests began with climate change, but after George Floyd, it intersected with Black Lives Matter. United Student Leadership members assert that teaching a multicultural, multiracial, bottom-up history is a necessary component of an honest and comprehensive education, one that goes beyond the whitewashed version of American history taught in many American high schools, a history of oppression that traumatizes students of color. South Whidbey students are a driving force for a racial reckoning, for a beloved community. This dream of and hope for a beloved community is expressed best by a 35-year-old preacher.
I still have a dream.
Yes.
It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day
Yes.
this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last."
At the Purchaser's Option was based on a 19th century slave for sale ad. It read, "For sale, a remarkable, smart, healthy Negro wench, about 22 years of age, used to both housework and farming. She has a child, about 9 months old, which will be at the Purchaser's Option."
I've got a paper shop I keep it. Will come a day when I'll be weeping. How can I love him anymore? This little babe upon my breast. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. I've got a body dark and strong. I was young but not for long. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my love, but not my soul. You can